Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Tiffany Wong. Indigenous people make up over 2.5% of the population in Taiwan. That's over 500,000 people. And they were uniquely impacted by both Japanese colonization and the arrival of the Chinese nationalist Kuomintang government on Taiwan. Generations later, social workers in Taiwan are working to address the unique historical cultural trauma that indigenous communities face. Today, we're joined by one such social worker, Ciwang Teyra. She's the president of the Indigenous Social Work Association and associate professor at National Taiwan University. Ciwang, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So what sort of issues are you seeing in Indigenous social work right now?
Indigenous Social Work Association actually is established in 2016. So around that time, we have a lot of social work practitioners and also researchers. We joined together to form this organization. And the main purpose is because we realize right now in Taiwan, the social welfare system is still lacking the understanding of indigenous perspective. So, but we also see a lot of social welfare policy implement top-down and by using the Han population based on their culture and perspective, and which does not really meet local indigenous people's needs. So that's the main reason the Indigenous Association, we formed together and try to unite indigenous social workers and also researchers together and trying to, hoping to have more research and also more and more local experience and working models and trying to have a conversation with government and also with the larger society. And I think the main issue right now for sure is, like I mentioned earlier, right now the policy in Taiwan we can see still we are hoping they could have a more understanding about indigenous needs. So in Taiwan we have 16 different indigenous nations, and which means among these 16 different indigenous nations we have different languages, cultures, and also some group we may have a different worldview. So when I mention here, which is a very important thing we need to pay attention, is sometimes when we're thinking about indigenous policy and indigenous rights and indigenous needs, from the majority society, their perspective, they will try to using the generalized approach, trying to think indigenous is a pan-indigenous culture, pan-indigenous background, but actually we are very different. So I think right now for our Indigenous Social Work Association, our main purpose is we're also trying to more different indigenous local social worker, their experience, and from different communities, and trying to show the differences indigenous social work working models, and hoping this can, in the future can turn into indigenous social welfare policy.
So it's also about the diversity within
Exactly.
social work for indigenous communities.
Yes.
So what kind of discussions are people having in your group right now?
Okay.
What are people trying to focus their research on?
So right now, I think one of the important conversation among indigenous social work in Taiwan, we're talking about historical trauma. In Taiwan's social work field, right now people talk a lot about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed intervention. But I think when people working with indigenous, the trauma focus is not individualized. We needed to have a collective perspective to understand indigenous background and the context. So historical trauma is a very important piece because the historical trauma trying to encourage people trying to understand today's indigenous health outcome or health behavior or today's life issues actually can trace back to colonial oppression coming from upper generations to current generations.
Can you give some examples of using that historical cultural trauma framework to explain some of the issues you might be seeing in indigenous communities right now?
Sometimes people, I feel like in Taiwan there's a stereotype to indigenous people, especially alcohol use. They will say indigenous people have drinking problems. I think that's kind of stereotype and a bias. But we also can see in some community, we do have some local people, they may engage in alcohol use. But sometimes in a majority society in Taiwan, when they see this situation and they were thinking about, it's because indigenous culture has a drinking culture. But actually that's not reality. My grandfather used to tell me, he grew up in a Telugu community, and then he say, we do know how to make alcohol. We have a culture knowing how to make alcohol. But he say, a millet, we make alcohol by millet. He say a lot of millet only are able to make a very small, tiny bottle of alcohol. but which means a long time ago we don't really have a lot of like alcohol accessibility. So he feel like we need to be aware what happened to our people. We used not to like engage in alcohol, but what happened for us today? We can see there's a certain amount of our people engaging in alcohol. There's something happened there. So I think historical trauma is a way to help to understand, because after experience the colonial oppression, like a forced relocation, and also like force us to speak in Mandarin Chinese, and also experience the hunting ban. That's all different type of like colonial oppression events. And then so when our people exposure to these events, then they may have some like we say health behavior issues, because those events are all the stressors. And then I also want to emphasize hunting. A lot of people thinking like a hunting practice is just a way for our people to access to protein or meat, but actually hunting is not just about the meat or protein. For our people, hunting practice is important way for our people to connect with like elders, connect with our other peoples in the community. Also, it's a way to connect with the spirit ancestors. So hunting practice is a way to create an important like relationship within communities. When we experience hunting ban, traditionally, we also can see hunting as a healing approach, because like I said, this is all like a relationship building when we practice hunting culture. But when we experience a hunting ban, we kind of lose important healing approach for us, which also means we're losing important approach for us alleviate stress. So drinking alcohol become a way like our people to feel like it's kind of coping strategy right now. But hunting actually can be a healing approach. So I feel like historical trauma right now in social work field, we feel is very important because it brings the historical lens to us.
And so ignoring the historical cultural trauma before kind of, gave blame more to just stereotyping of indigenous communities instead.
I think that's important, because I feel like today's indigenous people in Taiwan, we do face a lot of discrimination, stereotyping, and we need some different of different framework and discourse to encourage the dominant society to aware what truly happened for us. It's not just it's not our people's fault. Actually, that's a bit larger structural issue and larger historical structural issues. Yeah, there's also historical injustice happening.
How do you make people aware of that?
Oh, that's a good question, though. I feel like education is very important. So right now, for example, there's a different approach we can make people aware of it. In terms of education, in social work education, Indigenous Social Work Association in Taiwan, we try very hard encourage different universities in Taiwan. If they have a department of social work, we encourage them. We need to talk about indigenous history. And then we need to incorporate indigenous history in our curriculum. And also, we also need to encourage them to aware about historical injustice happening. But how to elaborate this information to students, I feel we need to using different approach.
Do you think that right now, like today's society, these stereotypes of indigenous people also kind of reinforces some of the issues that indigenous people might face?
I feel like today's stereotype and discrimination still is a still ongoing issue for sure. Another my research focus actually is about microaggression and discrimination. We do see that happening in school and also happening in our daily life. Sometimes I feel like Taiwan right now has some change, because Taiwan start to focus more about like international human rights issue. And then we also pay attention to different populations' needs. Even though it's gradually changed in Taiwan, we start to pay attention to like indigenous rights. But I feel like sometimes they are not truly aware. They are trying their best to try to help indigenous people. It's more like they try to help indigenous people, but not really aware about actually they bring like a discrimination. They have a discrimination immersed in his like languages. For example, sometimes when indigenous people they go to interview holding their CV, so the interviewer saw their CV and say, "Wow, you graduated from such a nice school. Wow, how come indigenous people can graduate from such a nice school?" They feel like they are saying that in a nice way, but actually for indigenous people, they may get like hidden information, more like why you're trying to emphasize my indigenous background, why you want to emphasize indigenous, how come we can graduate from this like like a popular.
Like, why is it a surprise?
Yeah, why surprised about that? And so they feel like, so for some indigenous people, they will feel like this kind of hidden information seems like trying to emphasize, actually we are, they think indigenous people are incompetent, can doing that. I feel like that's one example for the microaggression. I feel we experience microaggression kind of in our daily life. The other example is more like when people see indigenous people, they will say, oh, you must be good at drinking. I remember when I was a college student, a couple of my classmates, when they are aware I'm indigenous person, and they will say, oh, you're indigenous people, then let's go to bar, you must be very good at drinking. I think that's kind of stereotype about, they think indigenous people, tied with indigenous people with alcohol use. But actually, like I mentioned earlier, it's not our culture, actually.
But it could become a culture in a way if, if you're feeling socially pressured at school or something.
That's right. That's right. I feel like I think that's a very important conversation. For me, I remember in my second year in a college, like I mentioned, some of my classmates, and they feel like I'm indigenous people must be good at drinking, and I also see a lot of media like a TV. They emphasize that part, and also around that time, like 20 years ago, when I read a research paper. Around that time, a college student, research paper from our school. They say, oh yeah, indigenous people, they have a lot of a low income issue, a lot of issue because they are good at drinking. Sometimes they will miss this kind of connection, and then so you feel like in your interpersonal relationship, and people think you must be good at drinking, and also in the society, school, they think indigenous people must be good at drinking, but you see yourself, no, I'm not good at drinking, and around that time I got confused. I thought, oh, okay, so as an indigenous person, so he seems like I needed to be good at drinking. Otherwise, I feel like I'm not qualified to be an indigenous person. Right now, the reason I kind of pay attention to historical trauma and microaggression issue is also because my experience. When I grew up, I experienced, like I mentioned, the earlier experience. We know historical trauma, we know microaggression, discrimination can harm people, can harm our health. Can harm our health behaviors, and we do find a lot of evidence from our research, and so I feel like that's the main reason we wanted to emphasize anti-discrimination, anti-microaggression.
Yeah, it's really like looking straight into the root of the problem.
We hope our people can be, can breathe healthy in our daily life. I think for me, the main purpose not only me, I feel like for our members from our Indigenous Social Work Association, I think a majority of us, we all thinking the most important thing, the reason we wanted to create a more local models, we wanted to hoping bring Indigenous voice to the table, to let other people know, to aware. The main reason for us is we want next generation, we are able to breathe easily, and we have peaceful life. I think that's the main purpose.
Do you think there's anything still missing from Indigenous social work right now?
Of course, I think right now I feel like the challenging part, the challenging thing for Indigenous social work, I think, is about education. Yeah, because in Taiwan, we do have a very good school, we call it like a Donghua University. They have a College of Indigenous Studies. And they also, within this college, they also have Indigenous social work program. They are able to, through this education, to encourage more young generations to have a more understanding about Indigenous rights and the Indigenous history, and also have a more culturally sensitive approach working with Indigenous populations. We need more and more school. They have this, curriculum. We also need more school, like in Taiwan, especially social work department. They are hoping they can integrate Indigenous knowledge into their curriculum. I know in Canada, also in United States, they are trying very hard, trying to bring Indigenous rights, also Indigenous history, and also decolonization into their social work curriculum. I feel like that will be the next stage in Taiwan. We need to try very hard.
Thank you so much, Ciwang, for joining us. It was great to have you on our show today.
Thank you, Moashubadai.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, you can follow us on our social media or website. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.